In this module, you'll discover how to create a log analytics workspace in the Azure portal for Microsoft Defender for Cloud to improve data collection and security analysis. By the end of the training module, you will have understandings of the importance of the centralized logging solutions like Azure Log Analytics, Workspaces, and Microsoft Defender for Cloud. You're going to learn how to create and configure a log analytics workspace in Azure. You're going to gain insights into collecting and analyzing security data from Microsoft Defender for Cloud within the Log Analytics workspace. And you're going to understand how to create custom queries and alerts to proactively detect security threats and incidents. You're going to recognize the benefits of integrating Log Analytics workspace with other Azure services and tools. So let's get into this. The Log Analytics workspace is a data store which can be used to collect any type of log data from all of your Azure and non-Azure resources and application. It is recommended that you send all log data to at least one Log Analytics workspace, unless you have specific business needs that require you to create multiple workspaces. And you'll see this all come up on the web page as described in the design and Log Analytics workspace architecture. Microsoft Defender for Cloud can ingest information from locations other than the Log Analytics workspace. It collects data from various sources, including Azure virtual machines, virtual machine scale sets, IaaS containers, and non-Azure computers, including on-premises machines and other cloud-hosted environments, so that they can be monitored for security vulnerabilities and threats. The Log Analytics agent, also known as the Microsoft Monitoring Agent, or MMA, is used to collect various security-related configuration details and event logs from connected machines. This data is then copied to your Log Analytics workspace for further analysis. Additionally, Defender for Cloud can be integrated with other Azure services such as Microsoft Sentinel, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and Logic Apps. So let's go in and take a look at the workspace as well as the kind of information it's going to ingest. So let's go to the portal and I'll point out a number of these features before we do the exercise. So I'm here in the portal and you can see I've got a wide variety of resources that I've already deployed. And everything inside of Azure is monitored by default. Every single resource, I don't care what it is, by default is going to keep log information about the activity and configuration of that resource. And that information is going to be made available potentially to Microsoft Defender for Cloud if it wants to be able to monitor and check compliance of those resources. So I'm going to go into a variety of these and just show you some of the information that's there. And I'm going to show you a potential weakness and why Log Analytics workspaces are going to be an important tool for you to configure. So I'm going to come into, first of all, a virtual machine. Down the left-hand side, I've got a variety of configuration features. This is often referred to as a blade. And you'll see that I've got an activity log up here at the very top. Now, this is log information, but this is going to be log information about the object itself. And you'll see this common across all of the objects that we're going to take a look at here. Now, in here, I can go back and you can see that this log information is in what's called a Custo query language. I could query it, but in the graphical interface, I'm able to now select through a series of these icons here to be able to select a period of time over that I might want to select that information. So I'm just going to say the last month. And I'll be able to see some information about this virtual machine. For example, I can take a look at health events. When was it updated? When was it turned off? And so this is maybe some information that you might want to have as part of your compliance configuration. But this is general information about the object itself. Now, inside of this virtual machine, guess what? There's a whole bunch of logs. I don't know if any of you have ever gone into the logging of the server itself or the virtual machine. So inside, for example, Windows and Linux machines, there's an extensive set of logs that are available on the operation of the virtual machine itself. So for example, from an external perspective of Azure, I know when this machine was turned on. I know how much compute it used. I know how much memory it used. I don't know what it was used for, but I could tell you that at 8 a.m. this machine got turned on, was utilized to 90% CPU utilization, and it used X amount of memory. Now, was that running an application? Was it doing a diagnostics? You don't have that information because that exists that information exists inside of the virtual machine's logs. And in a coming module, we're going to show you how to get that log information out of the virtual machine and also include it into my log analytics capability so that it can be analyzed in my Microsoft Defender for Cloud compliance analysis. So that's activity log at general about the object itself. I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and under monitoring here, you can see that I've got alerts, I've got metrics, and I've got logs. Now we're dealing at logs at a different level. So I've got some metrics. Now metrics are slightly different than logs. Metrics are raw numerical information. For example, like temperature, it's 85 degrees. It doesn't say it's good, it doesn't say bad, it just gives you some information. It's 85 degrees, maybe the temperature of the CPU. I could tell you if the fans are spinning or not. All of that information, it is just metric information as a raw number. And you typically have to put a series of things together to see if there's a potential issue. Now, logs, on the other hand, are volumes of information around specific logged activity. So if a machine crashes, it's going to gather a bunch of information and have that in maybe a crash log of that event, and it's going to have all the pertinent information. So there's a volume of information at a point in time that the log collected that information, where metrics are typically emitted the whole time, and it's showing you a moment in time in which something takes place. But metrics and logs are available. Now, what I want to show you here is by default, you'll see that every single object in Azure is going to have some level of that capability. So let me go into the network security group. Again, there's the activity log of the NSG. And it's going to come back and give me some information about when was it deployed, how often, it's not going to show me all the network traffic that's going through. That's going to come under monitoring here, and I've got logs that are available for it. So there's just showing you a small example of every object inside of Azure has logs and metrics. There's two types of logs. There's activity logs and then the actual logs of the service that you're working with. Now I'm going to come back up into the activity log. By default, logs are maintained for 90 days. This is a free service. It's made available. So if I come into a custom period, and as of today, if I go back several months, so if I go back to 10, a little over 2 months ago, it's going to be able to do it. But if I go back further than that, so if I go back to 08, you're going to see I only keep 90 days of logs. So by default, the log information maintained for free by default in all of the Azure resources are only going to be maintained for 90 days. Well, you might want that information maintained for longer than that. And it's going to be up to you then to extract that information out of the default logs into a location where you can retain that information for a period of time that you need it, maybe for a compliance issue. See where we're going with this? Compliance. Microsoft Defender for Cloud is that compliance. Do we have the data? Do we have it for the period of time that we need to have it available to us? And so what we want to be able to do is extract this information from their default locations, whether it be in virtual machines, inside of the virtual machine, whether it be if it's an Azure virtual machine, I needed to get the logs from the Azure resources and the monitoring it does of the resource at the Azure level. AWS, what about on-premises? I need to collect all of this information and store it into a single location. This is where Log Analytics is going to provide this common repository that I was just talking about for you to take this information from a variety of sources and put it into a central location. And now we can collect that information, analyze that information. We often take a look at a thing called runbooks or workbooks. I'll show you an example of that when I get into the demo. But it also now can be consumed by a variety of other services, one being Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Now, you've heard us use other products. I mentioned Microsoft Purview as a data governance component where it can actually do data classification. It can pick up types of files if it's got secure information that is maybe identified as a national identity, whether it be a Canadian social insurance number or a U.S. social security number, whether it be a credit card number. It can identify files that have that type of information and classify that. It's Microsoft Purview. But we've also got other services that might come up in this context of Microsoft Sentinel. So within the Microsoft monitoring solution, know that all services are monitored by default. We have a free tool called Azure Advisor. And Azure Advisor, for free, will do an analysis against Microsoft recommended practices against the default data, 90 days, of all the resources running in Azure. And it'll make recommendations. I'll show you that in just a minute. And so by default, we'll give you kind of like a compliance report, but just on Microsoft recommended practices for free, 90 days. That's great. This is where log analytics, moving up the scale, is going to give you more information. It's going to be able to collect information and put it in a common repository of information that you want. It can take all the resources for an application. It can take resources from on-premises, from other clouds, bring it all together so we can analyze it in a central location. And you can then pay for storing it for as long as you deem it needing to be there. And so it gives you that extended period beyond the 90 days. We start moving up the ladder, and you might hear of terms in this realm that we talk about called a SIEM, our Security Information and Event Management piece of software, and there's a variety of them out there, or a thing called a SOAR, which is a Security Orchestration and Response. And in our world, in Microsoft, we have a thing called Microsoft Sentinel. And so Sentinel is our SOAR solution that now provides that security analysis and orchestrated response, very similar to what might be triggered through Microsoft Defender for Cloud that says this device is not in compliance, and then you can have your SOAR potentially be the reaction component that will then lock that feature down or secure it for you. So kind of showing you the broad spectrum of data sources, the type of data that's available for you, and how it can be used. So hopefully that gives you a big idea of what we're looking at. So I want to go in and show you the Log Analytics Workspace. And as we've done in other places, I'm going to come up and go into Log Analytic Workspaces. And similar to other objects that we created, remember when we created the network security group, it was just a container object that we put the NSG rules into. We then deployed it to a series of objects, but the actual NSG by default is just a container object, very much like a resource group was just a container object that we put things into from a management perspective. And that basically is the same thing with the Log Analytics Workspace. You create a Log Analytics Workspace, and there's not much to configure here. You select the subscription, you give it a resource group that you want it to appear in, and you give it a name and a region. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times, where possible, you want to have a single location for the storage of your log information in a single Log Analytics Workspace. Now, there's pros and cons to this. The pros are a single location. It means I'm paying for one copy of that information stored once. And so my storage charges, which are relatively inexpensive compared to other services, it's relatively inexpensive to store one copy of it. But if you start copying that information in multiple storage accounts or in multiple locations, example, we had one customer that kept it in its original location. They had it in Azure Sentinel. They had it in Log Analytics Workspace. They had it in Windows. They had it in all these different places. And so they had the same information in 4 or 5 different locations. And it was fairly expensive now because it was 4 times the cost versus having it in one location. So having one location, ease of administration, ease of security, reduced cost. Now, if you're starting to work with a global operation though, now what you're having to do is to collect information because Log Analytics Workspaces are region specific. So if I create this one in US West, I'm going to collect all the resources from US West fairly inexpensively because there's really no network traffic to take it from resources deployed in US West to a Log Analytics account in US West. But if I'm a North American or a global operation and I use this one account to store all the information into one location, yeah, it's one location, but now I might have data transfer charges. And so you've got to make a determination, is that going to outweigh the need of having the benefit of having only one Log Analytics account? What about the delay to replicate? Because it depends on the volume of information. You might have megabytes, gigabytes, or terabytes of information that could take a while for it to get ingested into the log analytics workspace before it then can be consumed by something like Microsoft Defender for Cloud to actually then show the compliance. And so an object might be out of compliance for a period of time before the information can be analyzed and show up as a failed compliance inside of Windows Defender for Cloud. So that might be a consideration you're working with. I mentioned the term previously called data domicile, actually storing data in a geographic region, depending on the kind of data. I'm originally from Canada, and the Canadian government has a requirement that any data about Canadian citizens must be stored within the sovereign region of Canada. So their data can only be stored inside of data centers inside of Canada. And this is very similar to Germany and other locations in Europe. They have data domicile requirements, and so that might force you to move from a single log analytics workspace into multiple log analytics workspaces. But now what you have to do is query information from multiple locations to get a common reporting you're working with. So pros and cons to both. We've got a great document that talks about the designing, and this is linked inside of the courseware. So if you're following along inside of the SC-5002 learning path that we've been walking through here, there's a link to this information, or if you just come into log analytics architecture, do a Bing search for that, you'll find this information, and it goes through everything I just talked about, design strategies and some of the benefits of having more than one or only one. So it talks about the design strategies. Operational and security of data considerations, I've talked about that. How easy is it to get it, cost to transfer it versus the security and compliance that you're dealing with. So there's quite a bit of great information in here. And there's that term tenant. Remember that by default, inside of a region, you have a log analytics workspace. Also, the same thing happens within a tenant. By default, it collects information from within inside of that tenant. And if you've got multiple tenants, how do I collect that information together? Not that it's impossible, it just makes it a little bit more difficult from a security and permission perspective. But we've got all of those considerations available for you. And as a general rule, start with a single one and find ways to make that one work, as opposed to just going, oh gosh, we're in every country of the world and we've got 2 different tenants, so I need 100 different log analytics workspaces. You'll find very quickly that that might not be the best design. You're better off to start small, start with one, and then argue off of that to say, there's benefits of not having one, but okay, well, we'll go to 2. But make small incremental changes as you go through the log analytics workspace. So when you take a look at that information, as I said, there's a variety of tables inside of it. I'm going to go back in and actually create that in just a second. But as I do that, you want to get into that retention period. I mentioned that at the start of this. By default, the log information inside of Azure is maintained for 90 days. And you'll often need that information for longer than that, especially if you want to show compliance over a period of time. And many organizations, if they are required to legally show compliance, they typically have to do it at least on a yearly basis. So I got to show that we were compliant for that year period. In many organizations, it might even be longer, and you'll see some of the default values here on the slide. I can actually have a tiered storage component that says, hey, I've gone through and I need current active information for maybe the last 120 days. It's more than the 90 that I can get by default. I can store that information in an active method that can be queried and used and analyzed. And then maybe if you are on a yearly compliance based on, say, a calendar year, let's say every calendar year at the end of it, January 1st, you can say, as long as I can prove that I was compliant at the end of it, I can now take that information and archive it. It's still available, but it's stored in an archive, a longer term storage, significantly cheaper, but it's not immediately queryable. But if you needed to, you could then do what's called a rehydration, bring that information back out of the archive account, and then be able to, if someone needed you to regenerate a report or something against that. And so here's this tiered structure again. If you go back into the architecture of log analytics workspaces, they get in and show you some of that information you were working with. So in the creation of the Log Analytics Workspace, as I said, there's not a lot to do to it. It's you give it a name, you give it a region and a resource group and a subscription for it to exist in. Now I've got a Log Analytics Workspace that I've already created. Let's go and take a look at some of the features you're working with. There's my activity log of the Log Analytics Workspace itself. We've got a term called IAM, or Identity Access Management. You'll often hear that term referred to as RBAC, or the role-based access control. These are the permissions that are going to be needed to query or use or consume that information at the object level. So we can actually have a variety of RBAC roles and we mentioned in a previous module, are you the owner? Are you the contributor? Are you the reader? And you can actually have fine-grained permissions to grant role access to something to say, hey, I just need to query the information to run a report. So maybe you just need the reader role. If you are publishing information, maybe you need the contributor role. And rarely do people need to have that the owner role, because remember the difference between a contributor and an owner is the owner has the capability of actually changing the permissions of the object, which should really be done by a security analyst. Now, Microsoft Defender for Cloud has roles that are part of the Defender for Cloud product set that you might need to gain access to features within Defender for Cloud, but this is a service outside of that, and you can now assign an identity to Defender for Cloud to be able to come and maybe read or consume this information that it needs to work with. Taking a look at other information along the way, we saw that there are log information. Let me get into the actual I mentioned there's different ways to get this information in here. I'll be doing this in the coming module, getting a set of agents. So these are, if you need to collect this information, say maybe from an on-premises location, you need to extract that information and communicate it back to the Log Analytics Workspace. This is where you're going to be able to get those agents to deploy to those devices. So a lot of configuration features for you to be able to get and work with this. I want to get into the table structures. And you can see that there's some default tables that we have in here for storing the different types alerts. And we've got operations and we've got usage. And so there's some default tables. If you've got custom information, you could then create the custom table to ingest that information that you're working with it. Now, the other thing that we have is once we get this information, it is just a storage repository. I mentioned the term KQL, or the Kusto query language, is a way for you to be able to run queries against this information if you want. So if you're familiar with KQL or Kusto, you can actually create these reports and do the querying information. And that's kind of what Microsoft Defender for Cloud is going to do, is it's going to query this information, ingest it to make its assessment based around the data classification or the standards that you've put out for compliance and non-compliance. Now there is another feature called run workbooks that you can create. Here's my workbooks. And so you can build your own workbook. So a workbook is a repeatable way to query and configure the information that lives in that Log Analytics Workspace. So the workspace is, again, just a repository, and these workbooks are processes to query, analyze, and report back on this information. So there's some built-in reports that you can have. You can see some for health and agent monitoring that you're dealing with. You can then use that again. You're going to be querying this information from Defender for Cloud to actually bring it into its compliance. But there is the workbook feature of the Analytic Workspace. The exercise here is fairly simple. I did it already. Just going in, you're going to create the workspace. This is going to be used later on in a later exercise, but right now this exercise is just creating the workspace. So that brings us to a conclusion of Log Analytics Workspaces as a repository for the storage of log information across a wide variety of resources inside of Azure, other clouds, and on premises in that hybrid world that you're working with. Hopefully you found this to be useful and interesting information, and I look forward to seeing you in the next module.